St. Andrews, Halifax. And the story really is the story of St. Andrews giving birth to something called the Center for Social and Spiritual Innovation, which we are using, for which we're using the acronym SASSI. St. Andrews has historically been a pretty privileged white church in the south end of Halifax, wedged between Dalhousie University and the three biggest hospitals in Atlantic Canada, not far from St. Mary's University and other educational institutions, or from the business center of Halifax. About 15 years or so ago, St. Andrews began a process of transformation. It really flowed out of a period of vulnerability after the end of a cluster of pastoral relationships with some pain, and that had been the third or fourth time successively that pastoral relationships at St. Andrews had ended with some pain. And the congregation had split in 1988 when the United Church of Canada began to ordain gays and lesbians. So I was just landing at that point, and I was landing from several years of work on Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa and the Southern Pacific, Fiji. And we did something like a TRC. It was called a Jubilee Year, which involved deep healing conversation, a lot of celebration, and then engagement with the larger community. And out of that, the ethos of St. Andrews began to transform, and it started to change from being a sort of bastion of confident service to the community by people from a position of power and privilege, serving mostly along a model of charity, to intersectionality. And St. Andrews is physically located on one of the major intersections in Halifax. And this intersectionality happened first, I would say, with engagement with other faith communities, especially the Shambhala Buddhist community and the Mi'kmaq community in Nova Scotia. It was given a great shot in the arm by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools. St. Andrews was probably the most engaged faith community in Atlantic Canada in that process. Number of key lay people being engaged, and I was asked to co-chair the United Churches Living into Right Relations task group with Maggie Dieter, then Maggie McLeod. And something about engagement in that process really changed St. Andrews, and progressively led to our understanding that decolonization was a part of us and what we needed to be about, coming to understand our historical legacy, and an acute perception of the siloing of different communities in Nova Scotia. So Mi'kmaq, African, Nova Scotian, immigrant, refugee, urban, rural, etc. I would say something else that really served to change how St. Andrews carried out its work was engagement in the Unbinding the Gospel process. This was something put out by Martha Grace Reese and made available through EDGEy. And it led St. Andrews into a deep process of spiritual practice in groups of about 8 to 12 people. At one point, we had 2/3 of the worshiping congregation engaged in an 8-week process of unbinding the gospel, weekly meetings, daily prayer and Bible reading. And it introduced something into our midst that I've come to call nonlinear causality. We came to learn that when you go deep into practice and conversation and listening, things start to just happen and you can't trace all of the outputs. In 2017, St. Andrews went through a remissioning process and came to re-identify its core values and its core mission. And the core mission really was about responding to spiritual hunger or spiritual poverty, working for social justice, especially in a way that breaks down historical silos, and really came to focus on leadership as a key calling. And then one of the things we came to understand through that remissioning process is that we no longer wanted to work on a missioning conversation on one track and a sustainability conversation on another, as though they were a two-row wampum, as though they were parallel tracks that didn't touch each other, but that the sustainability conversation and the mission conversation needed to link and become mutually self-reinforcing. And so we hired a social enterprise called Common Good Solutions to help us do a pretty extensive piece of research, received an Emerging Spirit grant for that. And CGS looked at communities like us that had property development potential and a kind of urban location and a mission of intersectionality. They looked at communities across Canada, in the US, and in Britain. Then after the research piece, we got CGS to help us with a consultation process that brought in about 40 to 50 different community groups, as big as Dalhousie University, as small as two-person NGOs from the African Nova Scotian sector. And what emerged was the idea of a Center for Social and Spiritual Innovation, SASI, which would have three core components. A hub space with co-locating partners of other faith traditions, social enterprises, and justice-oriented NGOs. So with offices, but shared workspace. That was one element. Another element was the opening of a series of new spaces for spiritual practice of different traditions. And the third was something that we called the Transformational Leadership Initiative. And that was an initiative designed to bring together about 24 emerging leaders, change makers from the historically siloed communities to go deep together in a cohort to build resilience and to develop relationships across those historical barriers. So this idea was born about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And so far we have not started to rebuild our hall space. We're in a deep development conversation with a view to that redevelopment. What we have done is removed all of the pews from our sanctuary and replaced them with flexible seating. So the sanctuary is now available as a place of spiritual practice for lots of different traditions and lots of arts events and community gatherings. We've also launched the Transformational Leadership Initiative with partnerships in partnership with Windhorse Farms, and this spring a cohort of about 25 people of African descent, both African Nova Scotian and African immigrant, African refugee, Latin American refugees, some Sikh folks, some Buddhist folks, a good number of indigenous people, and then about 3 or 4 straight white people. It was the room, of all the rooms I've ever been in Nova Scotia, straight whites made up the smallest percentage of that room that I've ever seen. And the amazing thing that happened was that all these folks who gathered looked and said, the usual dominant majority is not the dominant majority, and there was just a coming together of trust and deep sharing and storytelling in a way that I've never really seen before. Jim Drescher of Windhorse Farms is saying this may be the most impactful event that has happened at Windhorse in the last 30 years, which means, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of events. And the hope was that the cohort would want to continue building relationships. Well, that hope has been met in spades, and the cohort has been meeting organically in little clusters. A couple of weeks ago, a group of about 20 met in Halifax, and we should be gathering again as a full cohort in October at Windhorse Farm for 3 or 4 days. So that's where we're at with SASE and with TLI, the Transformational Leadership Initiative. It's grown a lot of legs with help from Embracing the Spirit with 2 grants. And now we're talking about being passed up the line to new ministries grants. So that's where we sit.